your limited influence on shaping your education at this university. The university as a whole is not a democracy, but that doesn't mean that you should trust those that are responsible for running the university to have your best interests at heart in making policy. And one way of influencing the nature of your education here is to participate in your student elections. So do inform yourself and do take advantage of that. First of all, good afternoon. And before I get into today's topic, I just wanted to make a couple of very brief announcements. One of which is that the makeup for those of you that missed the midterm will take place on the 6th of April during your study break. And the location is currently being finalized, but I will post an announcement as soon as I have that information. So make sure that you prepare for that. For those of you affected by that, or for those of you that missed the midterm makeup will cover the same material that was covered in the original midterm. Obviously, the questions will be slightly different. So much for the midterm. The final exam, the final test is obviously also coming up. But we have a bit more time with regard to that. And next week, in our last meeting for this class, I will do a general review to outline what is expected from you on the midterm, on the final exam. We'll try to leave as much time at the end of next week's lecture open for questions as possible. And to make that as useful for you as possible, I strongly encourage that sometime between now and next week, you try to get a chance to look over your notes and to get caught up in the readings. And if there's any issues that you find puzzling, that you find that you're not entirely clear on, that you don't have a complete understanding of, you can hopefully bring them to my attention next week so that we can clarify them, and hopefully you'll be better prepared for the final exam at that point. Before I begin today's lecture, let me briefly see if there's anyone that has any questions or comments relating to anything related to the class before we get into new material. Yes? Pardon me? Don't worry about that. It's actually, the outline is pretty much the same as for the 114, but I guess I was aware that I used that because they're slightly more detailed. No worries, it's the same material. I teach another intro to international relations downtown that has a different number, but the content is essentially the same. You had a question? Or somebody else had their name? Same point, okay. Yeah, no worries. You've got the outline with the correct 114 on the website, and the content is basically the same, so no worries about that. Any other quick questions or comments? Okay, in that case, let me try to pick up where we left off, and in that regard, focus on today's topic, which is the global commons or the global environment and its implications for international relations. The reason I say the global environment and the global commons is that one of the most influential writers on the subject is a guy by the name of Gareth Harding, who wrote a very influential book called The Tragedy of the Commons. The Tragedy of the Commons. And one of the things that he tried to point out in The Tragedy of the Commons is that throughout human history, there have always been commons, and commons referred initially to the arrangement in feudal Europe between lords and peasants, where the land was divided up between the peasants and the lord. And among the division was an area called the commons. And the commons was intended for the common use of all of those members of a community, particularly for grazing. And one of the things that Gareth Harding found is that in many cases, the commons ended up being severely degraded, in large part because in a commons environment, everyone has an incentive to use it as extensively as possible. And there is no one that oversees that the commons is not overused and therefore degraded. And essentially, Gareth Harding argued that what was true of the commons during medieval Europe is also true of the global commons, which are all of those things on the planet that are not owned by anyone, that are not directly controlled by anyone. Such as the air, such as the oceans, and so on and so forth. And the fact that they are not owned by anyone, that they're not controlled by anyone, means that everyone has access to them, everyone can use them as much as they like, but it also means that no one has a real incentive or real motivation to look after the long-term stability of those systems. And that's a major problem. Now, one way to understand that major problem is to begin our discussion of the global commons with a brief detour into something that might at first seem rather irrelevant. And that is to tell you about a rather distant place called the Easter Island. Easter Island is a small island in the South Pacific, very far removed from any other meaningful place on the planet. In other words, it's 1,200 miles from the nearest other island, and about 2,000 miles from the coast of Chile. It was discovered on Easter Sunday, 1722, and thus got the name Easter Island, by a Dutch admiral by the name of Admiral Ragueneau. And Admiral Ragueneau was in the middle of the South Pacific as part of his trips of exploration. He'd been pretty much on every other spot on the planet, and he simply stumbled across these islands. He didn't know they existed, or this particular island, and was rather puzzled by it. Basically, he found on that island, which is only about 20 miles across, in other words, a pretty small little patch of land in the middle of the Pacific. What he found on Easter Island was a population, roughly 1,000 people, that he described as the most primitive people that he'd ever encountered in all of his travels. Basically, Easter Island was a relatively barren rock. There was no vegetation on the planet, on the island, no trees. There was some grassland and so on. And the population primarily lived in caves and were apparently at constant warfare with one another. In other words, there was a division between various tribes and clans on the island, and they were constantly at war with each other. And a large portion of their diet consisted of cannibalism. Essentially, that wouldn't have been all that puzzling to Admiral Ragueneau. However, what made it puzzling is that at the same time that he discovered these people that were the most primitive that he'd ever encountered in any of his travels, he also found on these islands some fairly obvious signs that there had been a fairly advanced civilization that existed on that island at some point in the past. These signs of that civilization were that there were numerous ceremonial platforms, fairly sophisticated ceremonial platforms scattered around the island. That these ceremonial platforms had signs that whoever constructed them had a system of writing, and furthermore that they were in alignment with the stars, meaning that they had fairly sophisticated knowledge of the stars and therefore navigation and things along those lines. And even more puzzling was that the island was surrounded by a series of statues, which you're mostly probably familiar with. That's the most common image of Easter Island, is all those stone statues. And these stone statues were rather mysterious as well. They were huge. They weighed on average around 60 tons. And many of them had top hats on top of them that themselves weighed about 10 tons. And the origin of those statues and their top hats was not particularly mysterious. There was a quarry right at the center of the island where obviously that stone had been taken. What was more mysterious is how they were transported from the quarry to the edge of the island, several miles. Given that there were no draft animals on the island, there was no vegetation on the island, there were no trees and so on and so forth. And consequently, the conclusion that Admiral Ragueneau reached is that these signs of civilization could not possibly have been the result of the population that he encountered on the island. And that created a kind of a mystery that lasted for several centuries, and that was answered in various ways, the most creative of which was in a documentary that came out in the 1970s. That came out in the late 1970s that argued that this was the clearest sign on the planet, along with a few others, that we had been visited by people from outer space. In other words, that whoever made these were extraterrestrials that couldn't possibly have been humans. Well, that turned out to be largely false, and more scientific investigations of Easter Island have revealed a very different story. Essentially, what they revealed is that genetic tests of the population found that the population that exists on Easter Island were descendants of Polynesians. Polynesians started out in the islands of Southeast Asia, in what is now Indonesia, and the Philippines and so on, and slowly spread through various islands in the Pacific, and essentially Easter Island represented the farthest point of their departure. And that was fairly significant in that, as I pointed out, the nearest other island was 1,200 miles from Easter Island, and was 1,200 miles against the trade winds that they would have had to travel, and would have had to travel not knowing that there was an island or anything out there. And apparently, these settlers on the island, like settlers on other islands in the Pacific, brought with them various crops as they moved across the Pacific, things like breadfruit and various other animals and so on. That they used in order to establish their communities in other islands, like the Bikini Islands and the Marshall Islands and Guam and so on and so forth. The problem with Easter Island is that most of those crops died right away because Easter Island is quite a bit colder than the other Central Pacific islands. And that meant that when they settled there, they very quickly found themselves with only a couple of assets. One were sweet potatoes that seemed to thrive there. The other were chickens that they brought with them. And finally, unintentionally, they also brought the Polynesian rat with them in their various dugout canoes. And the upshot of that is that between the rat, the chicken, and the sweet potato, it formed a complete diet for humans, one that they could that provided all the basic nutrients necessary for human survival, and had the added benefit that producing chickens and producing sweet potatoes are not particularly labor-intensive processes. Meaning that these folks had a stable diet and a easy supply of food and a lot of spare time on their hands. Now the other thing that scientific investigation found is that when these folks arrived, which they estimate to be around the year 500 AD, roughly the time that the Roman Empire was collapsing in Europe, the island was apparently densely forested, although there was no sign of forests left by the time Admiral Ragueneau arrived. And that solved some of the problem as to how these folks managed to transport these heavy stones from the quarry to their final resting places. In other words, they used large logs in order to roll them across the island. Recently, I saw a documentary that explored the possibility that they might have actually transported them standing up and kind of walked them to their resting place. I don't know whether that's really accurate. It's an interesting hypothesis nonetheless. But the upshot of it is that the production and transport of these statues would have required enormous amounts of wood, and consequently led to the slow deforestation of the island. And apparently the culture that emerged on the island, which was judged by anthropologists to be the most advanced of the Polynesian civilizations that they came across anywhere, very quickly separated into several clans that competed with each other. And the form of competition was to gain the favor of the gods by constructing more of these ceremonial platforms and more of these statues. And that, in turn, required cutting down more and more of the trees in order to transport these goods. And slowly but surely, over the hundreds of years, the island became deforested. And as it became deforested, as forests receded, one of the problems in any place where forests are cut down is that forests, in particular in temperate areas, but also in tropical areas, hold soil in place. And if you deforest an area, the topsoil that sustains the forest remains behind and remains useful for agricultural purposes, but with every rain, some of it will wash off and slowly disappear. And that means that the land becomes less and less useful for raising chickens and raising sweet potatoes. Now the interesting thing in regard to that is that Easter Island is a very small place. It's only 20 miles across, meaning that it's very easy to gauge what kind of impact the practices of those peoples on the island had on the island, and it would have been relatively easy for them to recognize that what they were doing to the island was slowly undermining the ability of the island to sustain their population. And one would have expected, therefore, that having made that recognition and given the sophistication of their writing and so on and so forth, it's likely that they were aware of these processes, that they would have taken some kind of actions to prevent the disaster that ultimately came about. that they would have put aside their competition to build ever more ahus, as these ceremonial platforms were called, and ever more statues in order to preserve the forest. Because once he cut down the last tree, essentially the topsoil would, in a matter of fairly predictable time, disappear, as would the ability to build dugout canoes and get off the island and migrate elsewhere. The long and the short of it is, however, that their culture was so deeply entrenched and their competition between their various clans was so deeply entrenched that they never were capable of making that jump. And consequently cut down the last tree, and as soon as they cut down the last tree, or in a fairly short period of time thereafter, the civilization went into steep decline. And within a period of about roughly 100 years, went from the peak of that civilization to what Admiral Rogueneau encountered 100 years later, the most primitive people he'd ever come across on the planet. Now, why do I tell you about that? Obviously, this is somewhat analogous to the situation that we face globally, although our situation globally is far, far more complicated than the situation on Easter Island. And the question is, can we as highly intelligent creatures recognize the signs of trouble and collectively put aside our competition between different corporations and the economy and between different states in the international system and adopt collectively policies to avoid disaster. And on that, lamentably, the evidence is not particularly good or particularly encouraging. In other words, there's every reason to be highly pessimistic about the ability of the human species to avoid these kinds of disasters. And let me tell you a little bit about why I am highly pessimistic about this. A good starting point in that regard is that in 2005, the United Nations published its what it called its Ecosystems Assessment Report, which was the largest and most inclusive attempt by any international organization, by the scientific community globally, to assess the human impact on global environments. And that Ecosystem Assessment Report, which was produced by well over 1,000 scientists from countries around the world, the top scientists from each country involved, came to rather stark conclusions. It argued that in the last 50 years, a rising human population has polluted or overexploited 2/3 of the ecosystems on which life depends, including clean air and fresh water. And went on to argue that the ability of our planet to sustain future generations can no longer be taken for granted. In other words, that we're heading for disaster on a biblical scale. Now, why does that lead me to the conclusion of pessimism? Well, before I get to that, let me talk a little bit about some of the things that they found. They found, among other things, and thus were called the Cassandras. Cassandra is a figure out of Greek mythology who could tell the future, but was cursed with the ability to tell the future, which would seem like an odd curse. The reason that it was a curse is because while she was cursed to be able to tell the future, she was also cursed to not ever be able to get anyone else to believe what she knew to be the case. Among these dire warnings was one in particular about biodiversity. Biodiversity is an important factor in maintaining the resilience of various ecosystems. The more diverse an ecosystem is, the more resilient it is to shock. And biodiversity has always waxed and waned throughout the history of the planet. In other words, there have been periods of rapid extinction and so on. But even in periods where there isn't rapid extinctions, like the extinction that destroyed the dinosaurs, for example, that was apparently caused by the impact of a meteor on the planet and the resulting changes of the climate on the planet. Even in periods when there isn't such a disaster, there's always a rate of background extinction. In other words, there are always certain species that emerge and other species that, because of this slow change in their environment, decline and ultimately disappear. But according to the best available information, the rate of biodiversity loss currently, in other words, the rate of extinction currently, is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times the normal rate of extinction as gauged by previous historic epochs. Thus, a number of writers have started to call the current era the era of the sixth extinction, meaning that there were 6 periods of utter disaster when biodiversity plunged on planet Earth. We're now in line with what happened to the dinosaurs in terms of the rate of extinction currently. Part of that extinction or that rate of extinction is due to habitat destruction. Estimated that 60% of the ecosystems on the planet currently are irreversibly degraded. That's pretty stark as well. And part of that is land degradation and deforestation and the consequent desertification of large tracts of land, in particular closer to the equator. Another important component of that, and I'm only giving you the highlights, is stress on oceans. It estimated that 90% of the fisheries globally were either overexploited or in a state of collapse. And of course, fisheries make up an important source of protein for large portions of humanity, and thus overexploiting the oceans and degrading the oceans is very problematic. As many ecologists have also pointed out, what happens in the ocean, happens in the oceans happens to the rest of the planet. In other words, the oceans are to a large extent equivalent to the lungs on the planet, producing large amounts of oxygen and so on, and therefore degrading the oceans immediately has various other effects on terrestrial areas of the planet. Freshwater demand is another major problem. Around the planet, aquifers, meaning groundwater, are being depleted at a rapid rate, are declining very, very quickly. In some places causing countries like China, for example, to have to double the depth of their wells from year to year because of the steep drop in water tables. Furthermore, large numbers of rivers around the world no longer reach the ocean for long periods of the year, including major rivers like the Ganges. And lest we think this is all a matter of third world problems, the Colorado River hasn't reached the ocean in the summertime for several decades now, in large part because every drop of water flowing through the Colorado River is used in order to irrigate fields in California or fill swimming pools in Las Vegas and so on and so forth. Again, a major problem. And perhaps the clearest indication of the lack of sustainability is that last year it was announced that the average CO2 concentration on the planet had reached the threshold of 400 parts per million. The scientific consensus among climatologists is that the highest level of CO2 concentration compatible with a stable climate is 350 parts per million. Thus the name of the environmental organization, 350.org, meaning that we've already overshot that, and that we have to essentially at this point no longer talk about limiting greenhouse emissions, but actually have to talk about how to reduce the concentrations that are already in the atmosphere, never mind adding more to it. All of that's pretty problematic. Now, why does that lead me to pessimism other than the obvious implications of those figures? To come across the ecosystem assessment report, I had to look in the New York Times, where it was published not on the front page of the newspaper, not even in the front section of the newspaper, but in page 3 of the Science Times. The Science Times is an insert that appears once or twice a week in the New York Times, and most people don't bother looking at it. Now, you would think that a report like this that threatens destruction of biblical proportions would be front and center in the media, would be heavily reported on, and every one of us would be aware of it. But apparently that's not the case. The New York Times in that regard was not altogether representative. The Toronto Star, for example, did feature it in its front section, but it was on page 18, and the article that summarized it was about this long. In other words, one of those small little pieces. What that demonstrates is essentially that certainly the media and the kind of corporate power that the media represents tend to consider this an inconvenient truth that's best swept under the carpet. And as long as most of us are not aware of how dire the situation is, we are of course not inclined to do a heck of a lot about it. And for that reason, in part, I would suggest that we are in deep trouble. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the various aspects of the problem that we face globally and how it will impact global stability and international politics. One important component of this, of course, is population. Paul Ehrlich, one of the most influential writers on the topic of human populations, wrote a very influential book called The Population Bomb, a couple of decades ago already, in which he pointed out that he was a biologist that studied populations not of humans, but of various other species and ecosystems. And he pointed out that when you study the populations of various species and ecosystems, there are two patterns that emerge. One pattern is what he calls K-selected populations. K-selected populations refer to populations of generally relatively complex species, like apes, like tigers, elephants, and so on and so forth. And generally, their population patterns tend to match a pattern where populations increase relatively steadily but relatively slowly. And as they approach the carrying capacity of their environment, of their local ecosystem, they start to level off and stay below that carrying capacity and therefore stabilize. And that leads to relatively stable populations in the absence of external shocks to those ecosystems. The other category of species, which tends to apply more to more primitive species like bacteria, like moles, like cockroaches, like rats, and so on and so forth, is what he called sigmoid growth. Sigmoid growth means that these kinds of species can reproduce at an extremely rapid rate. In other words, can increase their populations extremely rapidly. And as they do so, they cut across the carrying capacity of their local environment, exceed the carrying capacity, which undermines the local environment and then leads to a rapid crash of that population. If you want to try an experiment in regard to that, try putting a piece of bread in a plastic bag and watch the mold grow. The mold will grow very rapidly until it uses up everything that's in there, and then it will die very quickly. That's sigmoid growth. Now, what he argued is, with regard to the human population explosion, or the population bomb, however you want to describe it, is that humans, throughout their existence on this planet, generally fit the description of a K-selected species. In other words, their populations has risen rather slowly, and for obvious reasons. Humans can't reproduce at the rate of rabbits or rats, let alone bacteria. They tend to increase rather slowly. Basically what that means is that in the 80 million years that the human species has been on this planet, it took basically those 80 million years to move from a population of 0 to a population of 1 billion. And 1 billion was reached in the year 1800. Today, the population of humans is somewhere around 7 billion and increasing rather rapidly. And essentially what he suggests, therefore, is that due to a number of different factors, around the year 1800, the pattern of human population growth started to approximate what would be called a sigmoid growth pattern. In other words, human populations rapidly rising and exceeding the carrying capacity of their local environments. Now, that would generally lead to a rapid crash of populations, and indeed that has happened in human history on a number of occasions, where the local populations have outstripped the carrying capacity of local environments. In particular, it's happened with regard to some of the great civilizations, like Rome, like the Mayan Empire, and so on and so forth, that a number of studies, and among the most interesting is the book Collapse by Jared Diamond, that looks at how a number of these societies collapsed, and basically comes to the very similar conclusion. Is that they outstrip their local carrying capacity, started to degrade, in particular, the soils that they depended on for their agricultural system, and slowly those soils lost their productivity, which made it more and more difficult to make ends meet, and consequently led to the decline or the collapse of those civilizations. Not everyone agrees with this rather drastic prognosis of Paul Ehrlich's. One prominent holdout was an economist by the name of Julian Simon. Julian Simon represented in many ways the prevailing wisdom in the field of economics with regard to the impact of human societies on the natural environment. To put it bluntly, modern economics has had as its basic core assumption with regard to the relationship between the economy and the natural environment, that the natural environment is an infinite source of resources and an infinite sink for wastes. An infinite source of resources and an infinite sink for our wastes. In other words, the basic assumption is that no matter how much the economy expands, no matter how much the economy extracts in the form of resources, there's always more to go. And no matter how much waste it cranks out and what kind of forms it cranks it out, it can always be reabsorbed by the natural environment. And to a certain extent, that didn't come out of a vacuum. It came out of the understandings of industrial systems and so on by some of the earliest classical economists like Adam Smith. But at the time that Adam Smith was writing, human populations were still considerably lower. He was writing before the year 1900. And furthermore, the kinds of materials that humans' economies made use of and the kinds of products they used tended to be far less disruptive than the current economy, meaning that most of the consumption was in the form of foodstuffs, and practically everything that was used by human societies was made of things like wood and stone that did not cause major environmental problems when they were disposed of. Basically, that meant that economists have always assumed that the economy can grow infinitely, that there are no limits to the growth of the economy. And Julian Simon expressed that in regard to populations. He essentially argued that there is scarcity of resources, and there is in particular one scarcity of the most important resource of all. And guess what that resource was for Julian Simon? The ultimate resource, the one that's in shortest supply, are human beings. And he had some evidence to support that idea, that far from being overpopulated, we're underpopulated. We need more humans and a bigger economy and so on. Essentially, his core evidence was that over the historical period of the last 100 years or so, on average, wages have been rising. And that's certainly true. Wages have been rising. Now, in an understanding of macroeconomics based on the idea of prices being controlled by demand and supply, the fact that wages are rising seems to indicate that there's a shortage of labor. Otherwise, wages would be falling. It's pretty sketchy logic, but essentially he came to the conclusion that there are no real limits and that population is not a problem. Furthermore, he argued that the needs of human beings for food, if agricultural systems became more efficient and more as efficient as some of the most efficient agricultural enterprises, could be met on a land area that he estimated would be roughly the equivalent of the state of Massachusetts and the state of Vermont combined. And by that he meant not the population of the United States, the population of the planet could be fed on that basis. And he said that, and he argued furthermore, that this could be reduced even further insofar as in the future, and again, this is to some extent happening, food would be produced not in open fields, but rather in high-rises, in which you have fields stacked on top of each other in order to reduce the need for acreage to produce food. Essentially, people like Julian Simon have been called the cornucopians. The cornucopians meaning that the planet is infinitely capable of supplying our needs without us having to worry about it. There's some important evidence that there's problems with those basic assumptions. If you're in doubt in that regard, the populations of various parts of the world are kind of interesting. One of which is that the population of developed countries currently is about 1 billion. The population of the developing world currently is around 6 billion, more or less. And both of those are expected to increase. The expected population by 2025 is 8 billion. By 2050 is 9.4 billion. And 90% of that growth in populations is going to occur in the developing world. Now, why do I mention that? The reason that I mention that is that we all know that climate change is at least partially a reality. How much of a threat it is very much is still somewhat debatable. But for the most part, outside of the US Congress, where there are still a lot of doubters with regard to climate change, most people around the planet, and certainly most scientists, have accepted the reality of climate change. And have accepted that climate change is currently occurring. Apparently, the best statistics indicate that the current average temperature on the planet is roughly 1 degree higher Celsius than it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And that the maximum that we can increase the temperature while keeping things relatively stable, the consensus is 2 degrees Celsius, and that's what the aim is of the Paris Convention and so on. But the reality is that glaciers are already melting at nearly 1 degree higher than the average pre-industrial temperatures. And the Arctic is opening up, even with this minor increase in temperatures thus far. And that minor increase in temperatures thus far, if it's related to carbon dioxide, was largely produced by first world countries. As I'll point out later on, roughly 90% of the carbon increase in the atmosphere since the beginning of industrialization has been produced by first world countries, only about 10% by developing countries. And of course, that has resulted in a vast increase in the standard of living, in the consumption levels in first world countries. But the problem is that most of the developing world aspires to the same consumption patterns that we enjoy currently in North America. One nice way of putting that was articulated by Mahatma Gandhi when he was asked about the prospects of industrializing India and producing similar standards of living in India that prevailed in Europe. He curtly said, well, it took half the resources of the planet to industrialize England. How many planets do you think it will take to industrialize India? The basic implication is that to reproduce the standards of living that prevail in North America among the rest of the population of the planet is simply impossible. Currently, the estimates in terms of carbon output, comparing North America, the average North American to the average South Indian or African, are that the average North American uses roughly the same amount of carbon as somewhere between 20 and 50 Indians or Africans. And consequently, if all Indians and Africans were living at the same standard of living as North Americans, obviously this problem would get phenomenally worse. And the extent to which this is the case is nicely illustrated by poverty rates. Absolute poverty in the United Nations is defined as an income below $370 per year. In other words, below $1 per day. In Rwanda, 80% of the population are below the absolute poverty rate. In Ethiopia, it's about 70%. In Honduras, it's 63%. In Brazil, it's 35%. All of that indicates that we've got some major distributional problems with regard to that. Now, let me talk a little bit about the sources, or how to understand the sources of this kind of environmental stress. And that will hopefully paint a slightly more optimistic picture of our prospects. And the best way to do that is to make reference to what in the field of industrial ecology is called the master equation. The master equation is, as you can see up there, I equals P times C times T. Now that's probably not particularly meaningful to you without further explanation. The I in that equation stands for the impact on the natural environment. And the impact on the natural environment is a function, first of all, of population. Obviously, the bigger the population, the greater the impact. That seems pretty obvious. Secondly, and we've already talked about the problems with population. Secondly, it is a function of consumption. The C stands for consumption. Some other industrial ecologists replace consumption with wealth, and therefore make it a W instead of a C, but it comes to the same thing. The more a population consumes per capita, the greater the impact on the natural environment. Again, that seems pretty obvious. The final variable, the T, stands for technology. And that requires a little bit of explanation. What is meant by technology here is not gadgets like computers and stereo systems and cars and so on and so forth, but rather technology here is understood as the means by which a population supports its consumption habits. The entire means by which a population supports its consumption habits. And T in that regard can be an important factor. And this is something that Barry Commoner, one of the first environmental economists, tried to figure out. And he tried to figure out the role of technology in this regard, in part by virtue of the fact that he recognized that there isn't a heck of a lot that we can do about population. Of course, populations could decline drastically, and might very well decline drastically. One of the problems with the way that we've organized human societies is that we've become, through globalization, ever more interlinked, ever more tightly coupled, as engineers put it, more closely connected to one another. And that has increased our ability to consume all sort of things from all sorts of regions of the planet. But it also means that a virus that pops up somewhere in China can overnight be transported to other parts of the world and can infect people all over the planet in the course of a week or two. And that means that if such a virus, a bad flu, something like the Spanish flu that killed millions of people in the aftermath of World War I, surfaced today, it would spread much more rapidly around the planet and could indeed reduce human populations rather drastically. Let's hope we don't go there. The other component is consumption, and let's face it, most of us, even if we recognize that we consume more than we should, are probably not going to be inclined to consume a heck of a lot less, even if we had the ability to do so. And furthermore, lots of other people aspire to similar consumption levels as ours, and who are we to deny them the right to be able to consume like we do? So there's not all that much we can do about those variables, but there might be something we can do about technology. And essentially, what Barry Commoner did is that he tried to figure out how important that factor of technology is. And he had a brilliant idea, and that is that if you looked at the United States has been gathering various kinds of statistics, including pollution levels and consumption levels and population, meaning that based on available statistics collected by the US government, Barry Commoner could calculate how much population has changed over a given period of time, how much consumption levels have changed over a given period of time, and how much pollution levels have increased during that same time. And the time period for which those statistics were available were from 1945, the end of the Second World War, and 1975, roughly the time that Barry Commoner did this study. Essentially, what he came up with is that according to government statistics, pollution levels in the United States had increased between 1945 and 1975 by 800%, which is pretty phenomenal. It's an enormous number. Now, how much of that was due to increases in population and increases in consumption? The population of the United States during that same period increased as well. It roughly increased by a factor of 50%, meaning by about 50%. So 50% of that 800% increase can be explained on the basis of increase of population. Consumption, of course, also increased phenomenally during this period. In other words, based on income statistics and consumption statistics collected in the form of income tax returns as well as the census and so on, he calculated that the average consumption level of American citizens between 1945 and 1975 roughly doubled. People were roughly twice as wealthy in 1975 as they had been in 1945. And that means that 100% of that 800% increase in pollution is explainable on the basis of consumption. And that, depending on how good you are at math and so on, means that somewhere around 650% of that increase is not due to population, is not due to consumption, is due to technology. Now that might seem rather bizarre and rather difficult to understand. But if you start to think about it, if you start to break down what is meant by that, it becomes very obvious why this is actually the case. In 1945, the average American citizen did not own an automobile. The majority of Americans were still reliant on mass transit, on trains, on buses, on bicycles, and primarily on walking for their transportation needs. And these had a far lesser impact than the automobile. By 1975, America had been transformed into a suburban nation. in which the average family lived in a big house, about a half an hour to a 45-minute commute from their workplace, and had a 2 or 3 car garage. Obviously, that technological change had an enormous impact in increasing the pollution levels in the United States. You can go through a number of different categories to make the same thing fairly evident. In 1945, things like disposable containers were largely unknown. Insofar as there were containers for things like milk, they were reusable ones that were delivered by the producer of the milk to your house and picked up the next day and reused over and over and over again. By 1975, people no longer had their milk delivered by the local producer, but went to supermarkets in their car to purchase everything that they needed, and everything that they needed was produced in disposable containers. Obviously, that has an enormous impact on the environment. In regard to clothing, for example, in 1945, almost all clothing was made from wool or cotton, in other words, from natural fibers that were biodegradable. By 1975, the majority of American clothes were made using various kinds of synthetic fibers like nylon and polyester and so on and so forth, which not only are petroleum products, but also not readily biodegradable, and therefore pose much more of a pollution problem than their previous counterparts. Again, you get the general picture. It's technology choice that has made the most important impact, not the increase in consumption. And technology choice was made basically on the assumptions that I outlined in classical economics. In other words, that the world is an infinite source of resources and an infinite sink for our wastes. And therefore we don't have to worry about it. We can choose our technologies only on the basis of what produces the biggest bang for the buck for us, and what is most convenient for our consumption patterns, without having to consider how compatible those kinds of things are with the natural environment. A good indication of that is that the first lesson in engineering courses dealing with waste disposal was that the solution to pollution is dilution. The solution to pollution is dilution. And that manifests itself in all sorts of ways. How do you get rid of sewage without it causing much trouble? Well, you dump it in the biggest body of water available so that it becomes diluted, which means the ocean. So much raw sewage has simply been pumped into rivers and from there into the oceans on the assumption that once it's diluted, it no longer causes any problems. Well, we now have extensive dead zones in large parts of the oceans, in particular where rivers feed into those oceans, because of the enormous amount of effluent that runs off through them, that creates algae blooms and so on and so forth. The same thing is true with regard to air pollution. Basically, how do you get rid of air pollution? Well, you dump it into the local commons, the atmosphere, through tailpipes in your cars, through smokestacks in your factories. And when you get local air pollution problems, like you did in Sudbury, for example, Sudbury, when I first drove through Sudbury, as you approached Sudbury, the environment around it began to look more and more like a moonscape, with little or no vegetation. That is recovered to a significant extent, basically because, again, the solution to pollution was dilution. In other words, they recognized that they were creating local problems with air pollution and with the local environment, and therefore they built superstacks. Superstacks were mile-high smokestacks that pumped those effluents higher up into the atmosphere, where they would become more diluted on the assumption that they simply disappeared in that context. All of that signifies that there are some major problems with those core assumptions about the economy and our basic relationship to the environment. Another way of thinking of that is that if you look at the problem of the environment through the lens of what is called industrial ecology. Industrial ecology is a field of engineering that studies entire industrial systems and studies those industrial systems in the similar way that biologists study the metabolism of organisms. In other words, the metabolism of an organism refers to the flow of energy and matter through an organism. And industrial ecology, in that sense, studies the flow of energy and materials through industrial systems, from their source to their ultimate sink. And one thing that, looking at industrial systems through this, and I don't expect you to become experts in this, makes it fairly evident. is that the industrial ecology of human societies was drastically transformed in the process of industrialization, in particular in the last 50 years or so. How so? In that at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, basically human societies subsisted primarily off of materials that were readily available in their local environment and produced wastes that were generally, not always, but generally absorbable by that environment. And by absorbable, I mean that they were reconverted into resources in the form of using sewage, for example, to refertilize soils and so on and so forth. In other words, that kind of relationship was relatively stable. Industrialization has created an ever more linear industrial economy. An industrial economy that only takes out of the environment things that are readily available and only produces wastes that can be readily reabsorbed by the environment is essentially a circular industrial metabolism. A industrial metabolism that uses ever more raw materials and produces ever more wastes that cannot be reintroduced into the environment, or for whatever reasons are not reintroduced into the environment in a way that the environment can absorb, is a linear industrial metabolism. Insofar as an industrial metabolism is linear, it uses resources at one end and produces wastes that ultimately become disruptive at the other end. And so long as you choose your technology merely on what produces the biggest bang for the buck, on what engineers call performance characteristics, rather than their context compatibility, basically you are likely to move ever more into a linear industrial metabolism. And essentially, from that point of view, what our current challenge is to reconvert our mostly linear industrial metabolisms today back into a circular industrial metabolism equivalent to pre-industrial times. But to get from pre-industrial times to today took 300 years. We don't have 300 years to accomplish the reversal of that. How could we accomplish the reversal of that? Well, one way to think of it is to look at a few countries where this has already been partially accomplished. And one of the best places to look in that regard is the country of Germany. The country of Germany has made fairly major advances in this regard. The Germans are by no means angels. The Germans are certainly not in the position of having major gains in this regard by virtue of the fact that they're smarter or anything of that sort, but simply for some fairly simple and understandable reasons. Germany is a country that is roughly half the size of Ontario. It has a population of about 80 million people. In other words, it's very densely populated. And that meant that throughout its history, in particular since the Second World War, it's had a very difficult time figuring out what to do with its waste. And for a while, it had a very easy solution to that. And that is that Germany was divided, and one part of Germany, East Germany, was very poor, and the other part of Germany was growing rapidly and was becoming very wealthy. And West Germany dealt, therefore, with its growing pile of waste by paying East Germany to take it off their hands. And the East Germans viewed this as an easy source of revenue, and also figured, okay, well, we'll get rid of it by dumping it, and they dumped it right on the border with West Germany, so that much of the effluent that flowed into the groundwater flowed right back across the border into West Germany. So it wasn't really much of a solution. But it became even less of a solution once the Berlin Wall came down and East Germany once again became part of West Germany. Suddenly it was a German problem, or a West German problem again. Suffice it to say that this problem, that was only partially dealt with in this manner, raised the attention of the German government. The German government had to figure out some way of dealing with this, and they set about studying what the problem really amounted to, and found that one of the largest component of their waste stream resulted from the automobile industry. The automobile industry that was creating large amounts of what ended up in landfill. And they studied the problem and found that the automobile industry consists of uses materials, most of which are recyclable and don't need to end up in landfills. But the problem was that it was enormously expensive to recycle them. Consequently, the German government simply said, okay, we're going to have a solution to this. We're going to get the top auto producers in Germany together, and we're going to tell them, look, either you solve this problem or we're going to solve it for you. And there's nothing that any industry likes to hear less than the government trying to solve one of its problems for them. So the German auto industry got to work very quickly, and they figured out that one of the reasons why it was so expensive to recycle these various components of their automobiles is because these automobiles were designed in such a way as to make them as easy to put together as possible, to assemble as possible, as cheap as possible to assemble, without any attention being paid how to take them back apart again. And obviously, in order to recycle them, you have to take them all back apart and sift them into the various different kinds of materials, and that was the enormous expense. So basically what they set out to do is to start a process known as design for disassembly, or design for the environment is sometimes also applied for that. And design for disassembly basically meant that they were starting to pay attention to how to tear them back apart. That had the benefit of very quickly reducing the cost of recycling these goods. It also had the benefit, the unintended benefit, that German cars suddenly became much more easy to repair. Because a large part of the repair cost, in many cases, was the fact that some little part that cost 50 cents went wrong, but to replace that part, you had to take the whole car apart, and taking the whole car apart would cost $3,000 in labor or something along those lines. That suddenly became less of a problem as well. So that was one means of creating a more circular industrial metabolism, simply to use the same materials over and over again. Another model that emerged also in Western Europe and has been imitated in a few other places around the world, but has limited possibilities, is the creation of industrial eco-parks. And industrial eco-parks refer to creating industrial systems that are similar to natural ecosystems. Natural ecosystems are systems in which the waste product of one species within that ecosystem is an input or is a source of food for another component of that ecosystem. So that the waste of mammals, for example, becomes a fertilizer to plants. Plants become food for those mammals, and so on and so forth. In other words, in natural ecosystems, all materials move in cycles, not in a linear pattern. How can industrial systems imitate that? Essentially, by creating industrial systems in which the waste stream from one industry becomes a source of materials or energy or what have you for another component of that industrial system. One of the best examples of that is in Kalundborg, Denmark, where a problem emerged with a power plant, a coal-fired power plant, that on the one hand had a hard time finding places to dump its ash, and on the other hand had to deal with a lot of waste heat. Driving turbines usually functions on the basis of boiling water, and that boiled water remains, or water vapor remains very hot, and you have to do something with that. You have to reduce that, or get rid of that heat somehow, and the way that they were getting rid of it was basically by pumping it into an adjacent bay. The problem that created is that it was raising the temperature of that bay, and therefore destroying the fish in that bay and the fisheries that depended on it. And that created political problems for the Danish government, and consequently the Danish government insisted that something had to be done. And essentially what they figured out is that, well, the waste product of a coal-fired power plant, the ash, can be an input to producing something like drywall. And consequently they encouraged a drywall manufacturer to locate close by. And the drywall manufacturer could also make use of some of that waste heat left over by the power plant. That waste heat was also sold to a brewery that made use of that heat, and was sold to the adjacent towns to heat their homes and so on and so forth. And in essence, by doing so, essentially you start to mimic a natural ecosystem and diminish the impact that that system overall has on the natural environment. How far can we go in that direction? Well, that's still very much an open question. Insofar as the German government or the Germans and the Danes had some success in this regard, and let's not overstate that. Germany touts its environmental record significantly by pointing out that it has reduced its greenhouse emissions in keeping with its commitments in the Kyoto Protocol, but it did so primarily by selling all of its steel plants, to China. Now, Germany hasn't stopped consuming steel. It now imports all of its steel from China. And that means that German consumption levels are the same, the technology used to support them are the same, but merely the carbon footprint has been transferred to China. But the Germans still benefit from it. It's, again, not to insist that the Germans are somehow more forward-looking in this regard. They simply have taken advantage of their situation and faced up to the music in regard to their situation, which partially depends on the fact that they're not a huge country like Canada, in which landfills are infinitely available. Let me look at another component of this, and that is scarcity. And scarcity in this regard is an important component of why the environmental crisis is an important topic in international relations. Now, one thing that you might observe is that scarcity and discussions of scarcity are nothing new. Basically, the prevailing wisdom among economists since the time of Adam Smith has always been that scarcity is permanent, that people always want more than they actually have or more than they can get. There's always scarcity, but that is more a theoretical position amongst economists than something entirely new. What is new is the recognition that resources are not permanently available. In other words, for economists, classical economists, scarcity was the result of our not using the available resources because we don't have enough labor and enough populations to use all of those resources in order to produce more and more goods and so on and so forth. It wasn't the result of natural scarcity. However, all of our industrial enterprises over the last several years, several centuries, have resulted in some resources becoming less and less available, becoming more and more scarce. And that realization dawned on policymakers, probably dawned on several scientists and others far earlier than that, in the 1970s. In the 1970s, in large part because of concern over the availability of oil. Oil became a crucial concern in large part because of the rise of OPEC and the threat that they were going to push up oil prices, and also because oil was starting to run out in various parts around the world, and it seemed evident that if we keep using it, it will eventually run out everywhere. Indeed, there were some rather dire predictions in this regard. One of the most dire predictions was that which was produced by a geologist by the name of Hubbard, that came up with what became known as Hubbard's curve, and that predicted peak oil. Peak oil, for those of you not familiar with it, is the idea that oil production would at some point peak and then rapidly fall off, and that all of the industrial systems on the planet that depend on oil as their primary source of energy would therefore collapse with it. And Hubbard came to this conclusion because he studied the oil industry historically in the United States. And he found that in the United States, the oil industry first emerged in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was the first place where oil was discovered and exploited. And he found that in Pennsylvania, it took about 30 years from the time that that oil was first discovered in Pennsylvania to the peak of oil discovery, to the peak of new discoveries of oil in Pennsylvania. And then it took another 30 years roughly from the peak of oil discovery to the peak of oil production in Pennsylvania. And once that peak was reached, production plummeted very quickly. And the reason for that is fairly evident. When you first pump into an oil deposit in the ground, there's a lot of pressure underground that pushes that oil up. So when you first pump into it, drill into it, you get what's called a gusher, where you hit the oil and all of a sudden it explodes out and all you have to do is collect it. But that pressure very quickly disappears. As that pressure disappears, you have to create that pressure. In other words, you have to pump something down into the ground to create the pressure to push the oil up. And that takes energy. And as the oil field empties out, you have to pump more and more down in order to get less and less out. And that in turn means that the productivity of these wells suddenly starts to dip rather drastically. And the amount of energy that you have to put in to get energy out starts to increase to the point where it's no longer productive to do so. Well, he found the same pattern prevailed when he looked at the next place that underwent a major oil development, and that was in Texas. In Texas, he found the exact same pattern. 30 years from the first discovery to the peak of discovery, 30 years from peak of discovery to the peak of production, and then a rapid fall off of production. And he calculated in the 1950s, therefore, that if you look at the United States as a whole, the peak of discovery of oil was in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and therefore the peak of production should come somewhere around the 1970s, and then drop off drastically thereafter. And he published this prediction and was pretty much laughed out of his profession for that prediction, in large part because in the 1950s the United States was the largest producer of oil on the planet, and it seemed absurd to suggest that the United States was going to run out of it. But the reality is that in 1970, oil production in the United States did drop off drastically, just as he predicted. And that in turn led a number of his followers to start to think about it in larger terms. If this pattern prevails in Pennsylvania, and then in Texas, and then the United States as a whole, well, what about if we analyze the planet as a whole? Well, if we analyze the planet as a whole, the peak of oil discovery came roughly in the 1970s. And therefore, we extrapolate from that, the peak of production should come at the beginning of the 21st century, and then production should drop off rather drastically thereafter. On the basis of that, many have predicted that industrial civilizations are about to collapse and that we should now be scrounging for oil around the world, but obviously that hasn't happened yet, and there's some complicated reasons for that. But suffice it to say that these worries that surfaced from the oil industry led to alarms about all sorts of other resources, and consequently an international effort by an organization that became known as the Club of Rome to gauge how much of a problem this was. And the Club of Rome essentially brought together a number of geologists and so on and so forth, and looked at various non-renewable resources like oil, like iron, like tin, like copper, and so on and so forth, and tried to gauge what the known reserves of those materials on the planet were, and tried to gauge the rate at which they were being used. And on the basis of that, calculate when we would need to worry about them being exhausted. And they came up with some pretty alarming statistics. Basically, among the most alarming, and again I don't want to go into too much detail on that, was that they predicted that the world supply of tin would be exhausted by 1988. Do we still have tin today?
Yes.
Of course we do. We never exhausted tin. There was something drastically wrong with all of this. The prediction simply didn't work. And it didn't work for some obvious reasons. It would seem pretty straightforward. You know how much tin is available, we know the rate at which we're using it, so it's pure math to figure out when we'll have exhausted that. The problem is, the problem with that calculation, is that when it comes to non-renewable resources, which were deemed to be the main problem, for the most part, the capitalist system works rather well. The moment that the Club of Rome published its report making these predictions, well, economic actors responded to that. And those that were in the tin industry thought, hey, if we're about to run out of tin, then we better start to buy more tin currently, because we'll be able to make profits in the near future when it becomes more and more scarce, and the price therefore increases. And the fact that investors were starting to buy more and more tin naturally pushed the price of tin up. Now, what happens when the price of tin goes up? Well, one thing that happens is that suddenly it becomes worthwhile to look for tin in places where previously it wasn't worthwhile to do so. A good indication of that is that at the turn of the last century, in 1900, iron ore was only considered worth exploiting if it contained at least 15% iron and therefore 85% slag. Today, iron ore is being mined at 3% concentrations. The reason for that is essentially because there are no longer available supplies of 15% iron ore, and because the price of iron has gotten so much higher that it's worth exploiting it at 3%. And that means that the supply suddenly went up, or the known reserves of that material went up. The other thing is that as tin became more expensive, in large part because of these predictions, increasingly those that made use of tin looked for other cheaper materials that they could use for the same purpose. And that means that while most cans, for example, were made of tin back in the 1970s, much of that has been replaced by aluminum. And aluminum is much more available, even though it is much more energy intensive as well. And again, that lowers the demand for tin at the same time that the supply goes up. Lastly, as the price of tin increases, the likelihood that you're just going to take a tin can and throw it in the garbage and bring it to a landfill diminishes, because it suddenly becomes a resource that's worth recycling. and therefore recycling starts to take place to a greater extent. The upshot of that is that we still have plenty of tin, and we're not likely ever to run out of tin. Tin is a non-renewable resource, but a non-renewable resource that can be readily recycled and can be substituted for. And the same thing is to a large extent true of copper. The same thing is to a large extent true of iron ore and things along those lines. And to a limited extent, the same thing is true of oil. Oil, of course, can't be recycled. Once you burn it, it's burned, it's gone. But nonetheless, the increase in prices of oil as a result of perceived shortages, and sometimes for completely different reasons, nonetheless made it possible to start to explore for oil in places where previously people didn't bother looking. At $20 a barrel of oil, it makes no sense to drill for oil in the oceans, simply too expensive. But once prices reach $50 a barrel or $100 a barrel, suddenly that makes sense. At 20 bucks a barrel, it makes no sense to try to exploit shale oil. In other words, try to cook it out of rocks, as the United States is currently doing. But at $120 a barrel, it makes perfect sense to do that. It made no sense to produce oil in the tar sands in Alberta at $20 a barrel. But at $120 a barrel, it's a different story. In other words, as the shortage increases, so too does the price. So does the price, and therefore so does the supply. The other thing with regard to oil is that as the price of oil increases, other technologies become more competitive. So the high price of oil suddenly made solar power and wind power and hydroelectric power that much more attractive and expanded those. And consequently, the problem with oil isn't that we're likely to run out of oil. The problem with oil is that we can't burn it anymore because it's screwing up our climate. And we do have alternatives in this regard. The real problem, and one that was completely missed by the Club of Rome, is that the problem with sustainability and with scarcity isn't non-renewable resources, which would seem obvious they're not renewable and therefore we use them up, they're gone, but rather renewable resources. And renewable resources were never really studied. And renewable resources were not studied because, hey, they're renewable. No matter how much we use, there's always going to be more. They're renewable. Well, it doesn't really work that way. Renewable resources are renewable in the same sense that the trust fund that your parents set up for you to sustain you over the next few years and decades is renewable. Now, you guys all have trust funds, don't you? No? Your parents didn't set up trust funds for you? Oh, poor folks. I don't have a trust fund either. But if you were lucky enough to have had this trust fund set up by your wealthy parents, your parents are concerned with you and therefore they create a trust fund of $1 million, they put it in a bank, and that means that if the bank is paying 5% interest, you get $50,000 income per year. And you can get $50,000 income per year for year after year after year, and you'll never have to dip into that $1 million. In that sense, it is a renewable resource. However, as most of us are aware, if you were lucky enough to have a trust fund set up for you by your parents with $1 million in it, and they send you off to university, it'd be very tempting to say, man, my university years would be so much more fun if I had a snazzy sports car. And consequently, you go out and buy yourself a $100,000 Mercedes and wheel around campus with that. Well, that means suddenly your trust fund is down to $900,000, and $900,000 only generates $45,000 of income. And on top of that, the insurance on your car is going to cost $10,000, and you have to maintain it, and fuel it, and so on and so forth. So your expenses are going up as well, and consequently, therefore, $45,000 probably aren't going to be good enough to make ends meet. And with every penny that you spend in excess of that, you're dipping further into the principal. And as you dip further into the principal, your yearly income starts to go down. And consequently, what could be a renewable resource becomes a finite resource. It becomes one that you use up. It's renewable only insofar as that you use it within its carrying capacity. In other words, only insofar as you only use the income, not the principal of that trust fund. And the same thing is to a large extent true whether you look at fisheries, whether you look at topsoil, whether you look at various other renewable resources in the natural environment. Basically, if you use them within their carrying capacity, they remain renewable. If you go beyond that, they very quickly become depleted. A good example of that is the passenger pigeon. For those of you not familiar with the passenger pigeon was a bird roughly the size of a small chicken that existed in enormous numbers in North America. They nested in the area around the Great Lakes, in other words, right around here. And they wintered in northern Mexico and Texas. Early settlers in the Middle West used to describe periods during the spring and fall during their migration when the sun would be blocked out for days on end because of these thick flocks of these birds that would pass over their land. Hunters describe shooting a bullet in the air without looking and dropping 10 birds with a single bullet. They were so thick. The problem with them was that they reproduced at a relatively slow rate. Each couple produced only 1 egg per year, and that meant that it would take 2 years for them to reproduce their own numbers, and 3 years and beyond to increase the numbers. Nonetheless, the populations were relatively stable. Natives used to use them as a source of food, primarily on the basis of shooting arrows up at the passing flocks. They only brought down 1 bird at a time, or throwing nets in the air and bringing down birds up by that method. But nonetheless, the populations remained relatively stable until the 1850s. In the 1850s and 1860s, the United States was starting to industrialize. The new industries in cities like Detroit and Chicago and Philadelphia and New York required cheap sources of food for their workers to keep wages down. And the passenger pigeon seemed like an ideal source of cheap protein. And consequently, an industry developed to start to hunt these birds and to use those to feed American workers. That worked brilliantly from 1860 to 1880. By 1880, they were in much shorter supply, and therefore the price started to go up. And as the price went up, they became increasingly a luxury food. In other words, something that was offered in expensive restaurants and so on. And of course, as the price went up, what happens to the incentive to hunt those birds? It goes up. In other words, the higher the price, the more people go out there to try to hunt them. And as more people hunt them, fewer birds survive. And as fewer birds survive, the price goes even further up, and so on. In other words, with regard to renewable resources, the market, which sends the right signals with regard to non-renewable resources, as we just discussed, sends entirely the wrong signals. And the upshot of that is that by the end of the 19th century, it was no longer a food product at all. It became largely a trophy bird because of its rarity, and the last one died in captivity in 1911. In other words, this enormous resource that was so plentiful that it seemed inexhaustible in 1860 disappeared entirely and became extinct by the beginning of the 20th century. Essentially, that demonstrates the problem with scarcity, in particular with scarcity with regard to renewable resources. And renewable resources and that scarcity have an immediate impact on politics. In essence, as a number of political scientists have begun to study, environmental scarcity can lead to political conflict. 2 authors that were particularly important in this regard was Robert Kaplan, who wrote an article called The Coming Anarchy, based on his observations in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular in countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone, in which he noted that environmental decline in those regions seemed to contribute to the rise of extreme conflict and to the rise of failing states. The other that investigated these relationships in a much more systematic manner was a fellow by the name of Thomas Homer Dixon, who taught for many years at this university. In fact, my first job at this university was to take over his classes when he was on leave. He subsequently has moved to Waterloo. And he wrote a number of books tying the rise of scarcity to conflicts in various parts of the world. And he argued essentially that one of the best ways to understand that relationship is to recognize that there are different kinds of scarcity. That mostly what we're talking about in the current context is supply-induced scarcity. In other words, where the supply of a particular good goes down and creates scarcity. But there's other forms of scarcity. Among them are demand-induced scarcity. Demand-induced scarcity is when the supply of a particular good remains constant but demand suddenly increases for whatever reasons in a drastic way. Finally, there is probably the longest form of scarcity that has been with human societies for many millennia, and that is what he called structural scarcity. And structural scarcity does not result from either the supply being reduced or demand going up, but rather from the uneven division of access to a particular resource. In other words, the concentration of wealth in the hands of very few that leave the many without the access to those same resources. The problem with trying to tie scarcity, and especially environmental scarcity, which is supply-induced scarcity, to conflict, is that structural scarcity has always been associated with conflict. The division between the haves and the have-nots has been the cause of revolutions throughout the ages, and in that sense is nothing new. And how do you separate these things? Well, Thomas Homer Dixon did so by pointing to a number of factors, one of which is population growth, certainly, which puts greater strain on resources and creates demand-induced scarcity. And argued that this kind of demand-induced scarcity, and scarcity more generally, is most problematic in those regions of the world that are most reliant on renewable resources. Sorry, I have non-renewable resources here. That's a typo. That should be renewable resources. And what regions of the world are most reliant on renewable resources? On agricultural goods and so on and so forth? Well, primarily those in the developing world. In the developing world, most of the population is still occupied in agriculture. And that over-reliance on agriculture has resulted in the overuse of land. The overuse of land by abandoning some of the traditional means of maintaining the land's fertility, such as multi-cropping and crop rotation, which has been substituted for by more intensive agricultural methods, primarily using artificial fertilizer and things along those lines instead of crop rotation and multi-cropping. And the problem with fertilizer is that in the long term it degrades the soil and consequently leads to desertification. And that means that the greater reliance on renewable resources, as well as the supply-induced scarcity resulting from desertification and land degradation, creates more tensions. And within those tensions, within that gap between supply and demand, it creates enormous opportunities for enrichment. In other words, as land becomes more valuable, those that are more well-connected, that are have more influence, start to capture the land that's available, and therefore exclude more others from them. So scarcity leads to what he calls resource capture, in which the wealthy, the powerful, try to gain control of as much of that resource as possible to enrich themselves. And that in turn puts more and more people into desperate poverty and is likely to result in conflict. Conflict does not always lead to failed states. However, when this takes place in the context of a state that is already rather weakened due to its post-colonial heritage and so on and so forth, it very quickly leads to a situation in which that state is no longer capable of maintaining itself as a state, is no longer capable of maintaining a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence, and therefore becomes more and more vulnerable to insurgencies. And insurgencies indeed arose in a number of countries of Africa in the 1990s, which led to Robert Kaplan's observations in this regard. It has also been tied fairly extensively to the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, as a number of economists have pointed out, was closely connected to food shortages. Basically, in the 3 years prior to 2011, there were a series of extreme droughts throughout the African continent, but also in the Eurasian continent, affecting in particular Russia, that led to a decline in the supply of wheat. And it led to, in the year 2011, a rise in the price of wheat globally of 80%. Now, 80% increase of wheat basically is an 80% increase in the price of food. and in countries in which large portions of the population spend most of their income on food. In our society, we only spend about 20 to 25% of our income on food, and therefore can absorb these kinds of shocks much more readily. But in countries in the Middle East in particular, like Tunisia, like Egypt, like Syria, that is not the case. The vast majority of the population spends almost all of their income on food. And an 80% increase in the food price, therefore, suddenly puts them underwater, and results in reactions to that. The reaction was, in the case of Tunisia, that in 2011, a food merchant that found it impossible to make ends meet lit himself on fire in protest. And that resulted in wider demonstrations against the government in Tunisia, and ultimately the overthrow of the government in Tunisia. It led to similar kinds of pressures in Egypt and in Syria. Syria in particular suffered likewise from these extreme droughts in 2008, 29, and 2010 that resulted in, and before I say that, let me point out that Syria was never an ideal democracy or an ideal state to live in. It had always been governed by a rather authoritarian government of Bashir al-Assad, and before that his father Hafez al-Assad, but it was a relatively stable but authoritarian state. And it was a rather stable state despite the fact that it had throughout its history the kinds of ethnic and religious rivalries within its borders that have torn the country apart currently. But what happened in the context of the years leading up to 2011 is that a large sector of the agrarian communities in Syria collapsed. And that led to an influx of those rural populations into cities. And that influx of those populations into cities, which did not have increased opportunities to absorb those populations, led to increasing rivalries. And those rivalries increasingly took on sectarian forms. And that in turn led to the protests and then the brutal put down of those protests by the government, which in turn led to the civil war and the falling apart of the country in its entirety. In other words, much of what we're seeing today in terms of the instability in the Middle East and elsewhere is at least loosely connected to environmental problems. And consequently, environmental scarcity and environmental destruction is likely to have an enormous impact on political stability more generally, not only in those regions that are already vulnerable, like in the Middle East and in parts of Africa, but increasingly also other parts of the planet. As is to some extent evident in what happened in the United States in the aftermath of Katrina. Basically, the American government, for all intents and purposes, abandoned the city of New Orleans to its own devices. And New Orleans has had a very difficult time recovering. That's a very different kind of an environmental shock, but nonetheless demonstrates that even very powerful countries like the United States can be overwhelmed by the results of global climate change, in this case in the form of hurricanes. So failed states are certainly an important thing to keep in mind in understanding the impact of environmental scarcity and environmental decline on the international system. But another very important component of that is how to deal with climate change. The reality of climate change is that 90% of the historical emissions of greenhouse gases over the period since the industrialization of Western Europe, in other words, in the last 300 years, has been produced by first world countries. However, the overwhelming impact of climate change certainly won't exempt countries like Canada or the United States or Western Europe from its impacts, but by far the more vulnerable are those in the third world. And that has created a major rift, a north-south rift in the international system, somewhat equivalent to the east-west rift that existed during the Cold War. In other words, a serious departure of interests between the first world and the third world. Why? Well, essentially, global climate change, if unchecked, will result in sea level rises. Sea level rises are anticipated, if it's unchecked, to get close to a 10-meter sea level rise by the end of this century. or sometime in the middle of the next century. A 10-meter sea level rise would essentially destroy most of the biggest cities that are on coasts. And the biggest cities in the world generally tend to be on the coasts for logistical and transport reasons and things along those lines. And that will create enormous numbers of environmental refugees. Not just in the third world, also in the first world. New York City will be underwater. Even a two-foot rise in sea levels will put the vast majority of the state of Florida underwater. What will happen to the population of Florida? They will have to move inward, and they will not be able to sell their properties in order to buy properties elsewhere. In other words, they will become environmental refugees. And in that sense, it might be worth Canada thinking about building a beautiful wall. And maybe even better, getting the Americans to pay for it. But I wouldn't hold too much hope out for that. I jest, of course. I don't anticipate or don't support these kinds of policies in dealing with these problems, and I certainly don't support Donald Trump. Nonetheless, extreme weather events likewise are having an enormous impact, not just on third world countries, but also on developed countries. So, for example, the Philippines last year was hit with the strongest typhoon ever recorded in the Pacific. Increasing levels of desertification and so on also largely affect those regions closest to the equator, in other words, countries in the developed world. Now, it is therefore understandable that most of the countries in the developing world, those countries that did not contribute in a serious way to the current problem, are insisting that this is a problem created by the first world countries, by the wealthy in the world, and that the wealthy in the world have a responsibility to deal with. And have a responsibility not only to deal with in reducing greenhouse emissions drastically, but also have a responsibility to compensate those countries in the third world that didn't contribute to the problem, that are suffering the consequences. In the same way, that if you back into your neighbor's fence and destroy your neighbor's fence, your neighbor can sue your ass and get you to pay for the damage that you caused to their fence. In essence, the third world is arguing that these impacts of desertification and so on are the result of the irresponsible actions of first world countries. And that therefore they are responsible not only for dealing with reducing greenhouse emissions, but also for compensating countries in the third world for damages and for helping them to mitigate against these kinds of damage by funding the building of seawalls and so on and so forth. What do you think the first world countries think of that proposition? Well, the easy answer is that the first world initially recognized that reality. In the negotiations that led to the Kyoto Protocol, essentially all of the industrial economies on the planet agreed that China and India and countries in the developing world should not be constrained in their ability to burn coal and oil and so on in order to produce development. That it was the responsibility of first world countries to deal with this problem and to reduce their emissions and to help the countries of the third world adopt cleaner technologies to bypass those problems and so on. Unfortunately, they couldn't get a unanimous decision on that, in large part because a couple of countries in particular held out. The most important country that held out and that was not willing to sign onto it, unless China and India also agreed to reduce their emissions, was the United States. And as we all know, if the United States isn't on board, nothing much happens. And that meant essentially that there were 2 decades that were largely wasted in the ability to deal with this issue. In fact, actually, there were more than 2 decades wasted. As was reported last year, the Exxon Corporation's top scientists came to the conclusion that global climate change was real and was likely to have catastrophic consequences for humanity back in 1978. And yet, rather than publishing those results, they sat on those results and instead hired a number of scientists basically to deny what they always knew was true. And as it subsequently turned out, most of the other big oil companies were also aware that this problem existed and was real, and nonetheless tried to obscure that reality for the period from 1978 to presently. Many scientists currently believe that in 1978 we could have dealt with this problem relatively easily, whereas quite a few scientists argue that whatever we do now is too little too late. In other words, we're already past the point of no return. I don't want to necessarily want to be quite that pessimistic, and since we don't know that for sure, and since the consequences of thinking about this are so drastic, I think that it's best for us to assume that we could certainly still slow the problem down, even if we can't solve it in its entirety. But nonetheless, a great deal of time was wasted. The Canadian government at the time signed on to the Kyoto Protocol and was not one of the holdouts. But the Canadian government, like many of its counterparts around the world, signed onto the agreement, but did little or nothing to actually achieve the goals that they had signed on for. And that was certainly true of the Chrétien government that signed onto the Kyoto Protocols, but did nothing to implement any policies to achieve those goals. And by the time Stephen Harper came into office, well, Stephen Harper was probably more in line with the United States in this regard, in denying that the problem even existed. But he basically stated that, well, now that the liberals have dumped this in our lap and have done little or nothing to accomplish this, we can't really accomplish it anyway, and therefore also did nothing to improve the performance of Canada. And the Canadians were not the only ones in that category. This is all a rather bleak picture. Increasingly, the United States now came on board in signing onto the Paris Agreement last year, in which it committed itself to reducing its greenhouse gases, in large part because it also got the Indian and the Chinese government to sign onto similar kinds of policies or similar kinds of commitments. However, one thing that was left out of the Paris Agreement, largely because, again, the United States rejected that notion, was the idea of a responsibility to subsidize third world countries in their efforts to mitigate against the impacts of climate change, or to compensate countries of the third world for damages already caused. That was strictly off the books, and consequently is not part of that overall agreement. Why am I pessimistic about all of this? One reason that I'm pessimistic about this is that last year was estimated that currently developed countries, while they have acknowledged that this is a problem and have started to spend money on developing solar power and so on and so forth, collectively are still spending 5 times as much on subsidies to the oil industry and the coal industry as they are spending on developing new technologies to decarbonize their economies. In that regard, there's still much too little going on. And one reason for that is that, to a large extent, I would blame the Western media for the lack of action, in that the Western media has gone out of its way to minimize the problem that we're currently looking at. And a good illustration of that, which returns us back to where we started, is the location of the publication of that report by the UN. It was buried by the modern media, and it was buried by the New York Times and the Toronto Star. By most other media, it wasn't even mentioned. And why is that? You would think that something as consequential as a report that predicts that within the next century we're going to have catastrophic environmental impacts, and that the ability of the planet to support human life can no longer be taken for granted, would be front page center. And would be shocking news, result in immediate action. The reason it was buried is because it was inconvenient for most of those in that fund the media. The media in general is an enterprise, a capitalist enterprise that makes a profit, and that makes a profit by selling advertising. And those that buy advertising are major corporations. Major corporations like General Motors, like Exxon, like British Petroleum, like Microsoft, and so on and so forth. And none of those major corporations have an interest in advertising in newspapers that publish stories that are likely to hurt their bottom line, or are likely to create an unfavorable business climate for them. And that means that editors, not the journalists are generally pretty responsible in producing these kinds of stories and following them up. But their editors often squash them or put them in the back pages or something along those lines in order to protect their ability to sell advertising to major corporations. In that regard, one of the major problems is that the public, for the most part, has been lulled into a sense of false security on these issues, and the media has generally tried to minimize the threat that we face in these regards. Let me leave my discussion at that, since we're getting to the end of my hour and my period of welcome here, and I've violated my welcome in this room too many times previously. So let me leave it at that for today, and see if there's any quick comments or questions or expression of outrage and disgust or anything of that sort before I let you go. If not, we'll see you all next week. And again, try to review your notes and your readings sometime between now and next week, so you can take advantage of the question period that I will provide at the end of the class next week. Thanks for your attention.